It's not calling you Josh Frydenberg, it's calling you Dosh Frydenberg.
Under the Coalition, taxes for hard-working Australians will always be lower.
You know, I don't hold a hose, mate, and I don't sit in a control room.
They're answers that only can come from Victoria, I'm afraid, because that's not my job.
But I ain't spending any time, though, because in the meantime, every 3 months, a person is torn to pieces by a crocodile in North Queensland.
Well, g'day, listeners, and welcome once again to the Two Jacks. It's episode 70, and, episode 70 where we put everything together. That is matters Australian, political and media, before we move on to have a look around the world. And joining me, as usual, is Hong Kong Jack. G'day, mate. How are you?
I'm good. I'm sitting here in the cold, in the dark. Well, it's not really cold, but it is dark. We're on a thunderstorm warming.
Oh, so it's only half a sacrifice you're making.
Yeah, but I just like it. It's St George's Day today, by the way. But it was Earth Day yesterday, and I hope you turn the lights off and all that sort of stuff.
The Earth Day. If it is Earth Day, I have a sneaking suspicion we're waiting for the weekend for Earth Day.
Oh, okay.
Here, they tend to do it on the weekends, and they have, of course, basically shut down entire city grids in the past. But I'm not sure what I'll do to celebrate. I'll probably just sit in a darkened room and in the fetal position and rocking gently from side to side and worried about it. Look, once you avoid being devotional about things like Earth Day, and they actually get into the business of reducing plastics around the world and so forth, doing practical things, it's not a bad idea. It's just when you become obsessive about it, I think that it's a bit of a problem.
Each year I think of the late great PJ O'Rourke and his comment on it. Everybody wants to save the earth. No one wants to help mum with the dishes.
This is absolutely true. Well, that would involve sometimes non-biodegradable liquids and a lot of plastic. So there you go. We did get a bit of a comment from an old friend of ours who's a loyal listener of the show, Grant, otherwise known as Trivalve. He made a number of very sensible comments about the show, but the one that caught my eye, Jack, was, and this is from Grant, the media in this country do not understand the meaning of the word alleged. TV, at least, you'll see, TV journalism, you'll see a 100-kilometre alleged police chase. Cars and wreckage all over the shop. You might allege who was driving, but the act definitely occurred. Do you want to comment on that, Jack?
Yeah.
They throw in the word alleged like, we're not quite sure what to say, so we'll just put alleged in there, we'll be safe.
Yeah, that's exactly right. They really don't understand what they're doing. This actually arose, I think you and I were talking about it last week, about the stabbing of the bishop. And there was just kind of no doubt that the bishop was stabbed because we've all seen the video, and yet they were calling it an alleged stabbing. Well, the motivation...
Well, the alleged culprit would be the right term.
Yeah. So there might be identification evidence to come, et cetera, but there was no doubt the bishop was stabbed.
Oh, yes, and that is still up on Twitter, some of the fairly ugly video. We'll get to the discussion there between, the battle between Elon Musk and Australia's e-safety commissioner. But on to other things first. In Australia, Jack, this is part of what the Australian government intends creating some legislation about. Is it called Building Australia's Future or Working Towards Australia's Future? It's a lovely little thing for an election, campaign. But what it means is that the government will pick and choose and fund, often by way of loans and often by way of straight-out payments, industries that they think should they should require or that need some development. On March 28, Albo announced the Solar Sun Shot project in the Hunter Valley. There have been a number of other things since. A green aluminium smelter has been set aside for the consideration of funding. I don't think it's actually been approved yet. And, of course, what we saw from Newspoll is that it's pretty popular with Australians. It's an easy one, really, for a government because people in this country believe that we should have a significant and substantial manufacturing industry. The difficulty is that compared to Southeast Asia, particularly China, Vietnam, etc., our high labour costs are going to render a lot of that manufacturing unprofitable.
Well, that and scale. We just don't have the scale with a lot of these things. I mean, I thought it was odd that they were using government funds for a solar panel manufacturing business when really the rest of the world is wondering how to deal with China's dropping the price on solar panels through the floor. So it's almost impossible to see how that could be competitive.
There are some issues there, but the solar manufacturers in this country, the remaining solar manufacturers, were interviewed about this. I think there's one significant company. It's not SunDrive, but there's another, the most significant manufacturer of on-roof solar panels. Has announced it as a good idea. The basis of this is that the Biden government's anti-inflationary act or deflationary act. You might help me out with the name of the act. It's
Inflation Reduction Act.
Thank you. It turns $520 billion into what we might call green manufacturing, Jack. And that's picking winners. The Japanese are doing the same. The South Koreans are saying that we will, the government will fund manufacturing on the basis of national security. And so I guess, certainly Albo made that point that if we don't do it too, we'll be left a long way behind. It is popular with the electorate. I mean, I've spoken to a lot of Conservative people over the years who go, why don't we make things anymore? Well, that's because we used to have really high tariffs in this country. And I often joke that Paul Keating went out one day to buy a cardigan and found that it cost the same as a Holden Commodore and decided that was the end of protectionism in this country. So that's the other way of looking at it. It is a form of protectionism, I should say.
It is. And I get the argument about, well, we need to compete with other people who are doing the same thing. I just don't have any faith that governments are particularly good at picking winners.
Particularly good at picking winners, yeah. Look, as I say, there's an aluminium plant. I think there were announcements already around some of the green stuff up in Queensland. I'm thinking of hydrogen, green hydrogen, those sorts of things. These are loans for the most part, so maybe not such a bad thing, Jack. What can happen? What can go wrong?
The loan doesn't get paid back is what happens.
And it's taxpayer money, yeah. Okay. All right. But as we discussed, Australians like the idea of us making things. It was a Kevin Rudd bit of a solo statement there too, that he wanted Australians to be making things. But when push came to shove on a solar factory there, Jack, he wouldn't bail it out.
No.
So there you go. You've got to be very careful with taxpayers' money. Onto the migration amendments. Just give us some background, Jack, on where we are and how we got to this point.
Well, the High Court had, for some years, allowed detention of people who were no longer had a right to remain in Australia and were not cooperating in their own removal. That is, they would do various things like not talk to the officials from their own government, wouldn't apply for a passport, etc., etc. And they threw that out. And there's a further case coming up.
Threw it out on the basis of constitutionally we cannot detain people for indefinite periods, yes. Which sounds relatively. It sounds relatively sensible. We're very sensible, But unfortunately, we had some a fair layer of miscreants in our slammers, basically wallowing away, and now they've been released into the community.
Yeah, including people who had committed crimes elsewhere and didn't want to be returned to face the consequences of those.
I think there's a Malay fellow who is looking at the death penalty if he's convicted of murder, if he was deported to Malaysia. And because of our treaty obligations, they would not deport him. Treaty obligations in regard to capital punishment. So there's a whole raft of people there. There are some fairly unpleasant ones there too, and then some just, I guess, what we might call difficult characters. And this was sort of a left to. It almost came as a surprise to the government, but it shouldn't have. That the High Court handed down this verdict, and now we've got the amendments, Jack, and just walk us through what those amendments would be that would allow some form of control over people who have who cannot be relocated, cannot be deported, but remain in Australia and can't be incarcerated.
Well, it's the idea is that they be compelled, with under threat of jail, to cooperate in their own removal.
Right. So
that's what the bill seeks to do. These are people who, in the words of the DepSec, these are people who have come to the end of a lengthy set of processes to determine their right to remain in Australia, and come up short. And what the bill seeks to do is to give some force to requiring their cooperation in their own removal.
And if they fail, that would be a breach of that law, and then that would allow them to be charged, presumably convicted, and then incarcerated. Is that correct?
Well, the bill as it stands has a requirement for a mandatory 12-month sentence. Now, that's been before a parliamentary committee, and I think 3 Labor MPs and 3 Labor senators have balked at that. And they don't want the 12-month compulsory.
On what ground? Objection to mandatory sentencing?
The whole box and dice. It's not entirely clear what their objections are, but that seems to be it.
Some of these to the point of crossing, they wouldn't cross the floor, though, Jack. They just wouldn't turn up for the vote, would they?
Probably. That's the usual thing in Labor.
Are they senators? I just can't recall.
3 of each, I think.
Okay. Well, it won't matter much in the House of Reps, but it would in the Senate if they don't turn up to vote and everyone else does.
It would. The people covered by this are mainly people who have been through, as the Deputy Secretary says, an extensive process of determining whether they're eligible to remain in the country. But it also includes about 10,000 non-citizens in the community whose refugee claims were rejected in a fast-track assessment process, which the UN has called defective. But that's where, we've spoken about it before, we have a problem of about 100,000 outstanding claims for asylum in Australia, and they're largely people who have arrived by plane and have made claims, a large number of which are really about staying in the country rather than genuinely seeking protection. They come from countries that wouldn't normally attract a protection visa, but because once the process starts to slow down and you get 4 or 5 years to get through the process, people say, great, well, if I apply, I've got 4 or 5 years working in Australia and I can go back to my old country much better off. So the government has done some fast tracking of that, and so they should. But people are concerned about, well, the UN doesn't think the process is satisfactory. People don't understand this, but if you apply to the government for a protection visa, they will go through a process, and if they say no, then your first port of call is to go to the Administrative Appeals Tribunal. And something like 50% of applicants to the Administrative Appeals Tribunal don't attend a hearing.
Right. So it's just delay. It's a delaying process. We talked about this in regard to Albanian groups that were that they were basically crime groups coming into the country seeking protection and got 4 or 5 years down the track before they could. They had basically exhausted all their opportunities. In the meantime, they're sort of one-man crime waves.
Yeah. Now, I actually tried this when I was making these decisions, just to see whether someone would take me to the federal court and test it. My view is if you can't be bothered turning up for a hearing, you don't have a genuine fear of persecution if you go back.
That's reasonable.
And I think the process should deal with them in that regard. They ought to be fast-tracked, which means you turn up, you make your case, and unless you get to a prima facie level, it's dealt with on the spot. So if you get to a prima facie level where this is a serious application, then it's triaged off and treated differently. But if you're just tying it on to stay there, dismiss it on the spot.
Fair enough. But Jack, when there's a sort of non-appearance at AAT hearings, is that under legal advice from immigration lawyers?
It's very hard to know from unless you're inside that conversation. I might add, there's another case coming up which has got the government worried. It's known as ASF 17, and it's in front of the High Court. It was argued during the week, and I thank you, Simon Jeans, a very good immigration lawyer. I saw this on the social media, and he linked me up with the transcript. And I think ASF 17 is going to have a bad day when the decisions come. Simon thinks he'll be hosed out 7-zip because the blowtorch was applied to his barrister but not to the Solicitor General. So that's generally an indicator that the case is in a bit of trouble.
Okay, so let's go back to what is proposed by the government, and let's assume that it gets through the Parliament and is enacted. How would that stand up to a High Court assessment, Jack?
I think it would go okay. It sort of depends upon how reasonably it's done. It's meant to be used as a strong arm tactic rather than banging a lot of people up in jail.
Right, okay. All right. Well, thanks for that, Jack. Immigration lawyer specialist, as you are, and as you indicated there, 3 federal Labor MPs and 2 Labor senators have joined calls for large chunks of their own government's migration bill to be scrapped. So there's a fair bit of work to be done in the Parliament anyway, Jack.
Yeah, and these things are tricky to get through. Look, to be honest, they're very difficult situations and they're hard to fix, with legislation. Traditionally, these things were fixed on a case-by-case basis with a bit of creativity.
All right, let's move on now. The Brittany Higgins payment has come under scrutiny in the wake of Justice Lee's verdict that Bruce Lehrman did, in fact, rape Brittany Higgins to a civil standard of proof. But, of course, when seeking compensation, Brittany Higgins received $2.4 million with the Commonwealth. There are calls, not from me, but there are calls from some journalists and others to investigate how this payment was made. Jack, I've got to say off the top of my head, if it's found that she's been raped to a civil standard of proof, then I think $2.4 million is a reasonable amount of compensation, don't you?
I don't know that the compensation was for that.
We don't know.
No,
we don't know, and it's not because we've had our heads up our backsides for the last year and a half. It's because the process was not transparent, shall we say?
And as to whether she was compensated for the rape, at that stage, no rape had been established when it was settled.
Right, fair point. And so the second matter is that she may have misled. Should I use the word allegedly, Jack? Misled the group that ultimately awarded. It's actually the finance department that oversee these matters, and that she may have misled them in terms of how the matter was dealt with and whether there was a cover-up, which is, according to Justice Lee's judgment, unlikely to have occurred. He looked at Fiona Brown's evidence and said he gave it greater weight than evidence either from Mr. Lerman or from Ms. Higgins.
Yeah. Just as a matter of practice, this does seem to have been settled very quickly for the Commonwealth. I've sat across the table from the Commonwealth over many years, and in terms of settling cases, they normally move with glacial speed.
And not this time.
And this has a whiff of a political fix because it does assist three Labor senators. The settlement did assist three Labor senators.
In what respect?
Because they had run, it seems, perhaps in cooperation with Ms. Higgins' partner, David Shiraz, a campaign to use the allegations Higgins made against Bruce Lerman to attack Linda Reynolds and her staff.
Well, that leads us on to the proposed defamation proceedings initiated by the former Defence Minister, Linda Reynolds, who's now left the Parliament. Over the weekend.
Sorry, but just before we leave that, I don't think this should go to the new
NACA. Yeah.
NACA. This is a political matter. It's this is something that a parliamentary committee ought to look at. Whether Senators Wong, Gallagher, and the then Senator Keneally interfered in the settlement process to make sure the settlement took place. That's what the gossip is. Now, did that happen? Did it not? That's a political matter, not a corruption matter.
Well, the left, the Twitter response, generally speaking, from those on the left, I'm not entirely sure whether I agree with that characterisation, but they said the Liberal Party reacted to the judicial finding that one of its staffers raped Brittany Higgins by questioning her compensation settlement. The compensation payment was for the harm caused by rape. There is a certain amount of truth in that, Jack, that we are, potentially re-prosecuting what is a deeply traumatic moment for Ms. Higgins.
Yes, well, that's why I say I think it's a political thing. The question is, what role did those three senators play? And that should be decided in the political arena.
Well, meanwhile, as we say, former Defence Minister Linda Reynolds received an apology from Brittany Higgins, and Reynolds said that she appreciated the apology and hoped that Justice Lee's findings in relation to the allegation of rape would give her peace. That's a quote, give her peace. But Reynolds said her legal action against Higgins and Higgins' fiancé, David Shiraz, was never about the rape claim. She's actually, I think, called for an additional apology and an explanation from Mr. Shiraz and Ms. Higgins in regard to remarks or comments that they made in regard to what Linda Reynolds didn't do or should have done.
This is the case that's in Perth,
yes,
which has been to mediation, I think, twice, and is due to go back to mediation again. And the judge hearing the matter has urged settlement, and I suspect that might be because he doesn't think any award of damages would be justified by the costs involved.
Well, let's look at some more perhaps collateral damage. Jack, Lisa Wilkinson's. I mean, where does Lisa Wilkinson stand now? I don't think anyone really is buying the fact that she was vindicated, and that she had, for want of a better term, should I use the word allegedly, Jack? That she had been an activist rather than a journalist, and that's always problematic. Where does she end up now?
I don't think she's got a huge future. I mean, I just got to say,
Well, Channel 10 used to have a morning show on, Jack. I reckon, Denise Drysdale's gig, she could have had that. Look, the first thing you do when you have a look at Channel 10, by the way, and free-to-air television in this country generally, I don't think we are going to have 3 commercial networks in the future. I don't think all 3 of them can survive at the moment. So in terms of local programming and things like that, and high revenue, high cost shows like 60 Minutes and Spotlight, we'll get to them in a minute. Those things are kind of going to be off the table.
Yeah, I think that's right. I'd just like to say that I have a sneaking admiration for Ms. Wilkinson and her husband, Mr. Fitzsimons.
Sneaking.
Yeah, well, I sort of look at them like I look at the Kardashians. I've always got a bit of admiration for people who can turn a modest talent into long and successful and careers.
That's
a good
deal, Jack.
And a good deal of wealth.
Lisa Wilkinson, you have to look at Channel 10's management because she joined Channel 10 because there had been an imbroglio. She was the former host of the Channel 9, they don't call it Sunrise, they call it something today, with her presenter.
Carl Stanoffrich.
Carl had got something in the order of $11 million and she was only on 8. And there was she was able to pull this off beautifully in the end because she had a number of product endorsements that basically took her up to the same sort of money that Stefanovic was getting. But she played, equal pay for women stuff, and Channel 10 thought, well, we can make hay here, and offered her a big contract. And in the end, you'd have to say, for her minutes on television, she was a presenter on the project, and they talked about special projects with her, and I guess the Lim and Higgins matter was one of them, but that's pretty much been it. If you could actually count the minutes she's been on television and divide it by her contract, and you'd have to say she's been pretty well paid.
The meter's spinning very fast.
Very fast, yes.
Well, I think they're both like that. I mean, look at Peter Fitz. He knocks out those books. Poor Gideon Haigh writes really good books, and no one seems to buy them.
Some of the best writers in the country. I sort of sit down with this. This is probably a topic for another time. But some of the best writers who crank out some of the most wonderful books, if be they bios or fiction. And I'll say to them, there was one fellow in particular, I won't mention his name, I said, how many copies of the book do you sell? He said, about 3,500. I'm like, oh, God, And it's a very worthy exercise. Publishing is so complicated and difficult in this country that...
But by comparison, Fitzy turns out what I would call historical potboilers, and they sell like cold beer at the cricket.
Well, you can buy them by weight. That's right. And it's sometimes called junk history, perhaps wrongly, or sort of popular history is another sort of euphemism around this sort of stuff. Very good friend of mine, Paul Ham, is a wonderful historical writer, lives in Paris now, and his books do sell, but not quite, and meticulously researched. I mean, years of research. And as well as his books do sell, nowhere near fits.
Like I say,
so hard work gets you nowhere.
Like I say, they're Australia's Kardashians, the Fitzsimons, Wilkinson crew.
I'm very, very vexed on this issue, Jack. The E-Safety Commissioner versus Twitter. It would seem that the E-Safety Commissioner, Julie Inman-Grant, has said to Twitter, you must take certain things down. We'll get to what they are in a minute. And for every day you don't do it, you'll be subject to, I think, a $700,000 per day fine. And this relates to, and I have seen this footage because it's on Twitter and hasn't been taken down, what is called gratuitous or offensive violence with a high degree of impact or detail, and relating to the alleged stabbing. And we've got the alleged stabbing in there, Jack, as I'm reading from, I think it's an Australian report, the stabbing of Bishop Mari Emanuel by an alleged culprit. That's the way that sentence should read. Jack, what I'll start off by saying is mainstream media can't publish this stuff. No? They cannot publish these videos. They will fall foul of the regulator. You can call it censorship, but we do have regulators in this country to ensure that material of a high level of violence cannot be seen on our televisions, on our and in our newspapers, and on our media websites. But X under Elon Musk says you can, and you'd be able to find this material on Telegram, and other social media platforms. So, as a member of the mainstream media, I find it a little bit unfair or unreasonable that Elon Musk thinks he should be able to publish this stuff without penalty.
I'm still not convinced that this shouldn't be published on either on mainstream media or on social media.
We do see. I've seen this stuff.
Like everybody else, I've seen the video, and I thought, well, look, there is no good reason for me that shouldn't be in the media.
I just have to disagree, Jack. And I learnt this the hard way when I was working in Lads Mags, and I'd bought a whole lot of film from Afghanistan of the Taliban's excesses that included beheadings, corpses strewn on the ground, and those sorts of things. And I wrote a story about that, and we put it in the book, and then we took it around to the old regulator, the Office of Film and Literature Classification, and we obviously had girls in various levels of nudity in the magazine as well, but that wasn't a problem. The problem, we were bound not to be able to publish that magazine because of those 2 pages that included obviously acts of very, very extreme violence. So these things are in place. But they're not in place. Well, they are in place according to the E-Safety Commissioner. I checked out Simeon Boykoff's feed as that story was unfolding in Wakeley, the stabbing of the bishop and the sort of affray that occurred outside. Looked at the video. It's not the most ghastly thing I've seen. But I've got to ask, what's the point of being able to see this stuff? Essentially gratuitous violence. What's the point? What are the benefits? What benefit do we get from having a percentage of our population looking at actual violent imagery? There's nothing there, is there? There's no good will come from it.
Yeah, I don't. There's a whole lot of things that are on mainstream media and social media that I don't think there's any benefit to the community in seeing. But I think I'm a bit of a believer that people ought to be free to see as much or little as they want.
Well, so that would include.
And my problem is who gets to decide what they can and can't see.
Well, we have to have a regulator. I mean, we've always had a regulator. You know, whether it's print journalism or the internet now. I mean, should people be allowed to watch the Christchurch massacre? You know, this is the issue. What good can come from people watching violent episodes over and over and over again? Real, actual, gruesome violence. And I just don't see a point there. I mean, and if our mainstream media is prohibited from broadcasting it, then why is the social media platform allowed to?
Yeah, well, you might have a point there. They've gone beyond this, the E-Safety Commissioner. they want this taken down from Twitter altogether.
Yeah.
And what Twitter said is, no, we will geo-block it. That is, we won't allow people in Australia to see it, but we're going to put it up. And that's what happens with the mainstream media.
Well, have they actually agreed to geo-block it? I don't know that they've offered that as a solution. What they've said is that they won't accept a global takedown.
Yeah, well, my reading of it is that they say, we're going to appeal the decision not to allow us to put it up there, but in the meantime, we will undertake to geo-block it to Australia.
Well, it's not geo-block, mate. It's not geo-block.
But we won't take it off the international media. So it's an interesting question. I don't know where it's going.
Look, it is. It's a really interesting question to have, and I'm glad we've been able to have it. But my issue is that material still sits there. You can find it under various troublemakers' sites. That's where I came across it. Simeon Boykoff was publishing it with glee. I cannot see any point in people. What happens if you look at violence, actual violence, for long enough, it just becomes normalised. And that's a very dangerous situation. But we'll see how it goes. The usual suspects, libertarians and what have you, have jumped on board of Elon Musk. They treat him like he was born under a very large star in Palestine a couple of thousand years ago. But I think there are some bigger issues there that need to be properly understood. What we're not taught. The idea that we don't have censorship in this country, or if you want to turn it the other way, free speech absolutism, okay, well, let's talk about child sexual exploitation material. Right? Now, that's clearly censored from public viewing. But if you're a free speech absolutist, you should be allowed to look at that. And I just don't get that. There are some things that we shouldn't be saying. And I don't think too many people would argue with that if you put it in the right context to them. Over to the Middle East. And Qatar, Jack. Qatar's got a very significant role in negotiating a way forward in Gaza, doesn't it?
Well, it's sort of the home of Hamas.
It is
at the moment. That's where the leadership resides.
Mm-hmm.
It looks to me like Qatar is reevaluating the strategic outlook for the Middle East. They are walking back their role in any ceasefire negotiations, and they are saying that they've been let down by some leadership. They don't specify what it is.
Some leadership, that wouldn't be Benjamin Netanyahu at all, would it?
I think it's Hamas.
Oh, is that what they're saying?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm told, Jack, I don't know. I mean, some of the top Hamas leaders are billionaires. How does that happen?
Yep. How does that happen? Because the West keeps funneling money into Gaza, and it doesn't get through to the people.
So they haven't made it. They haven't made it in oil-rich Emirates countries. They've made it essentially by theft.
Yes, in the same way that Yasser Arafat died a very rich man.
Oh, okay. So Qatar.
I think his wife owns a large chunk of property. Yasser Arafat's wife lives in comfort in Paris in a large chunk of property that was paid for by the international community's support for the PLO.
And with good intentions.
Well, sorry, I'm not sure her intentions were good.
No. The money was handed over with good intentions. It's just those good intentions weren't realised.
Yeah.
All right, so things did escalate last week, Jack. There was a retaliatory strike. Well, we had a strike on the Iranian embassy in Syria that came from Israel. Then the response that we talked about last week. I read a wonderful piece in the Wall Street Journal about this, that the long period in the Biden administration where they wondered just how effective their defences had been against the Iranian attack. As it turned out, they were quite effective. I don't believe there are any lives lost. Missiles and drones were shot down from a coalition of the UK, US, Jordanian Air Force, the Israeli Air Force, of course. And then, of course, there was always going to be a response to that attack, and that was a military strike it was a missile strike, not Air Force, missile strike from Israel in Isfahan. I think it's the second largest city in Iran, Jack, a very historic city, but it has a military base just outside it. So the attack was on the military base, as I understand it.
So it would seem.
We haven't heard too much about that. What do we expect now from Iran? We talked about their initial response, and while there was considerable concern within the White House and I guess elsewhere around the world about how extensive that strike might have been, one of the terms you used last week is that all you got? And perhaps it was a deliberately mild response, or indeed it is all they've got.
The other thing that's changed for the Iranians is the degree of support that Israel got from the Arab nations. That the strategic outlook in the Middle East is changing.
It definitely is, but aren't we sort of heading towards the Great War in the Middle East, essentially driven between Shia and Sunni Iran and Saudi Arabia, for example? Aren't these tensions heading towards that way inexorably, or almost inexorably?
Yeah, but from the Iranian perspective, they had, for a long time, they'd had the Sunni Arab co-religionists prepared to sit on the fence while they battled Israel. That's no longer happening. The Gulf Arabs, Jordan, Saudi, Egypt, have had enough of Iran.
It might be now is a good time to tell a story from a great friend of mine now gone, Mark Colvin, the ABC foreign correspondent for many, many years. Mark was a wonderful journalist and textbook exemplar of a fine journalist. He was in Iran during the Islamic Revolution, Jack, like 1979-80. Yeah. And he was in, as I say, Tehran when that happened. And all foreign journalists, after the revolution had come and gone, were dragged out in buses outside Tehran and ordered out of the bus. It must have been a terrifying moment because there are basically armed guards, armed soldiers with AK-47s, get out of the bus. And as they got out of the bus, all they could see were just corpses, people who'd been killed by the regime, just an endless supply of dead Iranians there. And then they're all bundled back onto, journalists were all just bundled back onto the bus again. And Mark always used to tell this story, and he was saying, we were terrified. They thought they were going to be executed. But what happened was the militants, the people who would become the mullahs, were saying, this is who we are. This is who we are. And we want the world. You show the world who we are. And that is sort of mass murdering, oppressive regime. And they've really never really taken their foot off the gas in that respect since.
That's I've heard that story before, and it fits with a whole lot of stuff that I had to read about Iran in a professional life some time ago. But there has been a significant realignment in the Middle East. That's something Iran is discovering.
All right, we'll keep an eye on that.
Can we just pause for a minute?
Well, apologies for that. We just had to have a little spell there. We're both elderly gentlemen, and every now and then we get that sudden urge to get up and release a bit of fluid. And that's all that happened there. But we are moving on now to the Trump trial, Jack. Opening statements from prosecutors yesterday indicate that it was a case of election interference, Jack. That's going to be a pretty hard case to win, isn't it?
Yes.
Well, look, we know it was about hush money. We know that there are a number of individuals who receive funds, and we know there's probably a little bit of dodgy funding around it. But it's
none of that's illegal, by the way.
None of which is illegal. We haven't seen Melania in court because presumably she's not terribly pleased with what's going on. So it is one of those sort of Trump misbehaving things. But winning the case that it amounts to election interference rather than stifling, let's say, which is a very normal political practice, by the way, stifling a scandal, where the illegality might have occurred is, in hush money payments that were ultimately taken from campaign funds and then misascribed, I suppose, as legal advice. I really thought it was an interesting angle from the prosecutors, and the defence in their opening statements, so I think it's handled it fairly well.
Is there any reason why a majority of voters won't see this as political? I mean, I've been watching the news the last week about this. What's her name? Ruth Marcus from the Washington Post and Rashid Tlaib, the congressperson from Michigan. They both said the quiet part out aloud. Ruth Marcus spent 1,000 words pondering, how have we got ourselves into this situation where we're bringing the wrong case first against Trump? Yeah. And then Rashid Tlaib was saying, we wouldn't have to be doing this if the Senate had done its job and impeached him. And both of those statements just make it look like this is a political attack on Trump.
Well, I think that the first statement is quite true, but I mean, that's beyond anyone's control. I mean, Trump is obviously seeking to extend these matters. It would seem that this one, the New York hush money 34 count indictment, would may well be the only criminal trial prosecuted before the next federal election or presidential election, and it is, and has always been presumed to be, the most minor of them. Let's assume he's found guilty on at least some of the counts, Jack. I can't even see a jail sentence. There's no mandatory sentence in place. I can't see a jail sentence. And
it just, to me, it just looks terrible for the Democrats to be doing this.
Well, yeah. I mean, I don't agree with you that this massive conspiracy involving the Democrats and prosecutors around the country.
I'm not alleging a conspiracy. I'm alleging individual Democrats have set out to do this. Letitia James, the New York Attorney General, and Bragg, the district attorney who's prosecuting this case, both campaigned on a platform of prosecuting Trump. That's not a conspiracy saying everyone got together and agreed. As individuals, they campaigned for, they're both elected positions.
Okay, well, will of the people, Jack.
And they campaigned on a basis that we promised to prosecute Donald Trump.
And they won. So presumably the people of New York want Donald Trump prosecuted.
But my difficulty with that is, and I think what's going to harm the Democrats is, that's not how the law is supposed to work. You don't set out to prosecute a person. What you do is investigate a crime and prosecute someone if you think they're guilty of the crime. And they did it the wrong way around. They actually put on paper, put on video, that we are going to devote our life, if you elect me, to prosecuting a person. Now that's in the wider, that might be popular in New York, but it isn't going to be popular in the Midwest.
Well, we'll see. We'll see about that. Obviously, the the MAGA hat wearers and the rusted on, they're not going to change their minds at all. I think in terms of practical politics, the state of New York requires Donald Trump to be present on every day of his trial. And so that means he's going to be off the campaign trail for 6 weeks. And I think that might have an effect, and you can talk perhaps about conspiracies around that, but it is going to have an impact on his ability to fundraise. It's going to have an impact on his ability to speak to his rusted-on followers in his rallies. And we might see, we talked about polling last week, Jack, we might start seeing a little bit more of a comeback. So let's just have a look at it, Jack. General election, this is the Marist poll. General election, Trump v. Biden, Biden by 3. General election, Trump v. Biden v. Kennedy v. West v. Stein. Same Marist poll, Biden plus 5. And New York, Trump v. Biden. And that's a Siena poll. Biden by 10 in New York. No surprise there. In fact, I reckon it should be a bit more. There was an NBC News poll which has Trump by 2 in a head-to-head. Then there's an NBC Trump v. Biden v. Kennedy v. West v. Stein, which puts Biden ahead by 2. As you quite rightly pointed out, he'll need to be a few more points ahead than that, Biden that is, to win. But that would sort of, just interestingly, these last 2 NBC polls, they would indicate that the presence of Kennedy is probably reducing Trump's vote more than it is Biden's.
Yeah,
Early days.
I actually watched the NBC Meet the Press, and Trump leading Biden by between 4 and 22 points on handling a crisis, 46 to 42. Strong record as president, 46 to 39. Dealing with inflation and the cost of living, 52 to 30. Necessary mental and physical health, 45 to 26. And Trump has a 9-point lead over who was competent and effective. That's something that Biden won by 10 points in 2020, and now it's reversed to 9 points the other way.
But he's won the poll, Jack. He's won the poll. He's 2 points up. Head-to-head, Trump v. Biden. This is the NBC News poll. Trump v. Biden, 46-44, right? Then you put, this is the point I'm trying to make, when you have all 4 on the ballot, Trump, Biden, Kennedy, West, Stein, Trump's vote goes down to 37, loses 9 points, Biden only 5. And that's the point I'm trying to make, is that Kennedy, for all his blather and nonsense, might actually be Trump's a serious problem for Trump.
Yeah, CNN, I can say, in Georgia, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, Trump's ahead by 4 points at least in all of those.
Well, the Fox News poll's got Wisconsin at a tie. This was done on Friday, April 19th, so it's only 4 days old. Trump v. Biden in Pennsylvania is also a tie. Michigan, Trump by 3. Georgia, Trump by 6. When you put Trump, Biden, Kennedy, West, and Stein into Georgia, it's Trump by 7. So it's not immediately clear. You've got Fox News. This is Fox News polling, and just for our listeners, it's pretty good. Morning Consult, these are other recent polls, has at a tie. North Carolina, this is Mason-Dixon polling. I would care less about that. Still very, very open, but I would think what we are seeing is a bit of a comeback from Biden. So the Marist polls was pretty highly regarded, as you know, has Biden ahead by 5 when we take into account all 5 candidates. So there is a shift. I mean, you can talk about why, but there is a shift. And it may well be that, you know, maybe it's related to the trials, or maybe the Biden v. Trump head-to-head was always going to be an early days expression of dissatisfaction with Biden. But as we get closer to an election, there is perhaps, and I'm only speculating, there is perhaps a view that no one wants Trump, not enough people want Trump to be president again. So it's interesting, but there definitely has been a shift, and it's probably somewhere around 3 or 4 points. As for why, we don't know. And really, we need to look at the calendar and say, well, it's April, and it all happens in November. So the polling, if we made any wild statements around the polling now or even beforehand, you're likely to be very, very wrong in the end.
One thing the Democrats could do is get a lot smarter. They shuffled poor old Joe Biden out to a whistle-stop performance at a, what do they call them, Sheets. Got to say that very carefully. They're gas stations, as they call them, petrol stations, and filmed him because Trump's been playing on social media almost every couple of days a performance where he does something. He went into a bodega in Harlem last week, and he went to a Chick-fil-A somewhere else, and he normally gets.
The Chick-fil-A was interesting because he had one of his operatives come across at him like she was, Mr. Donald Trump, it's lovely to meet you, but it was one of his employees.
Yeah. So Joe goes to this Sheets and gets a completely indifferent response, right? And that's okay, but why did they release the video? Because within 2 hours, the Republican National Committee was playing the Chick-fil-A video and this one top and bottom on social media. So you just don't do this stuff.
Meanwhile, of course, Jack, when we talk about Republicans in Congress, they did, in fact, vote through in the House, voted through the military support, military funding for Ukraine. I think some $50 billion. And that showed a bit of maturity amongst the Republicans, didn't it? That it just basically rejected the Marjorie Taylor Greene extremism. I was pretty impressed by that. The bill will now go to the Senate and will be passed in the next couple of days. And I'm sure no one will be more relieved than President Zelensky. But it showed that it's not necessarily an expression about Trump or anything like that. It's more the Speaker in the House and others saying we are not going to be beholden to extremists like Marjorie Taylor Greene. Yes. I thought it was a sound and solid move. I'm not a huge fan of the Speaker, but he looked at Marjorie Taylor Greene and just said, "You are not going to ruin my day."
This is a lesson for all political parties: is that you will have people within your group who will do you harm unless you stand up to them.
Yeah, and that's it. You know, so now Marjorie Taylor Greene is left with this sort of nonsense that somehow she can roll the Speaker when she's already proven on the floor to have less than 100 votes behind her.
Yeah, anybody who spent any time in a political party learns this lesson, that there will be people within your own party that you have to fight tooth and nail against to prevent them wrecking your party.
Yeah, good bit of maturity there from the Republicans. As you know, not a fan, listeners, but showed a bit of maturity there. Student loans, Jack, what's going on there? Now, basically, we've got...
What struck me about this was that the president's against some opposition from the courts, and it will be interesting to see whether this stands up in court. I think it probably won't. But these are taking over the debts of people who've got student loans from college in the United States. But the current plan would see 750,000 households who are making over $300,000 a year have their debt paid for by the taxpayer. And I think that's extraordinary, really.
Well, I mean, nice work if you can get it, Jack. Yeah, look, you've always had concerns about this. It doesn't seem to have, the student loan repayment thing doesn't seem to have had any particular political benefit at this stage for Joe Biden, has it?
And that's because a clear majority of Americans didn't go to college.
Yeah. So Nate Silver's weighed into it, Jack. He said, just go to a state school. The premium you're paying for elite private colleges versus the better public schools is for social clout and not the quality of the education, and that's worth a lot less now than people have figured out that elite higher ed is cringe. Oh, he's gone all street patois there, Nate.
David Bird said, just send them to a party school. Send them to a state school with a great big football stadium, let them have a good time. Much better for them.
There you go. That's a good way to avoid huge amounts of student loan indebtedness. EVs in the United States, Jack, we have looked at this before. Sales are sort of plummeting up from fairly reasonable, from really up to some big highs in the last couple of years, particularly around the pandemic. Not for any reason, but during the pandemic, EV ownership did grow. So it's not looking all that flash for the EV business, particularly in the States.
Yeah,
walk us through some of the figures.
What struck me about this, Jack, was that it's the non-EV owners. Just 9% of non-EV owners said they were seriously considering a purchase. That's down 3 points from last year. 35% saying they might consider an 8% decline from the year before. So it's not just the people who are not buying them now, it's the future intentions of other people. Seems to be getting worse.
Yeah, I think there'll be ups and downs. So there are particular problems in the States with infrastructure. And I see this pop up on my Instagram quite a lot with people going to charging stations and often finding that the charging stations themselves are either not functioning or only have one or two charges, and then there's a long period of waiting and so forth. So that might be something that is dragging people away from... And
in the north of the United States, the cold, the batteries don't go so well when they get cold.
Yeah, okay. All right, in Ukraine, Jack, not quite the forgotten war, but we are seeing some real problems arise. Of course, we just mentioned...
I thought you were going to reprise the Mark War joke there.
No. It's a little bit too serious for that. We won't get into the Mark War. That was was known as Afghanistan, of course. There are issues around funding for Ukraine, and this $51 billion US injection will help, although it'll take some time to get through to them. But there are some issues around, that the Ukrainian line in eastern Ukraine is starting to deteriorate, and that should not surprise anybody. I mean, when you think about the production of things like artillery rounds, Russia's going to be being able to produce 3 or 4 times more gear. That's pretty much the way it works across the board. It's where battles have become a bit smarter, where the Ukrainians seem to have succeeded, particularly in the Black Sea. But in the end, without significant support, the Ukrainians are going to struggle against what is a military monolith.
Yeah, where it starts looking more like the Somme, then the numbers matter, and Russia's got the numbers.
Yeah, they do. They've just got the manufacturing power, Jack.
And the manpower power.
To a lesser degree. I mean, we do understand that their casualty figures are much higher than the Ukrainians at this stage. I mean, the Ukrainians cannot afford that that number to be turned around. What we do have is just that ability, the military machine to just to completely overwhelm it, just in terms of artillery rounds, particularly when you are bogged down, artillery rounds and munitions and the production of them. Whoever wins that battle, and it's always going to be Russia, is going to be in a good spot. So the aid package. Who came up with this stuff, Jack? I mean, I'm just looking at this. Except Putin is not the aggressor. He warned countless times. Who wrote this stuff?
This was all over social media. This is the debate. This is how low the debate got.
Oh, I see.
Quite extraordinary, really.
There are a lot of forces that are pro-Putin around, and I keep an eye on some of them in Australia. They tend to be linked to people like Simeon Boykov, the Greek fascist movement, Golden Dawn. The Serbian groups involved as well, and they'll tell you until they're blue in the face that Putin is not the aggressor. The answer, which came from the American Congress or the American House, was that they are not just going to let Putin win. And that would be an absolute disaster should he basically take over Ukraine.
The live question, though, is exactly what does not letting Putin win mean?
Well, people would like to see this war over. I understand wars are awful and terrible and people lose their lives, particularly civilians. I mean, we're seeing again Russia launching missile and Air Force strikes, airstrikes against Kyiv and other cities in Western Ukraine. These are causing civilian casualties. They're designed to reduce morale, these sorts of things. But these are outrageous crimes in themselves. So the answer is we should be able to stick it out longer than him. That's the answer. And if Europe stays strong, with the exception of Hungary and one or two others, if Europe stays strong and the United States stays strong, that's what will happen. I mean, the Russian economy simply won't be able to handle it the longer this goes.
But at some stage, someone's going to have to articulate what the end result's going to be. Does it mean getting the Donbass back? Does it mean getting Crimea back? Does it mean overwhelming Russia? What's the actual end result?
At this stage, what it should be, Jack, is you go back to the borders pre-February 2022, and then we'll talk. That's the negotiation.
That means getting the Donbass back, but not Crimea.
No, that shouldn't be a negotiating point. Take yourselves back beyond the borders of February 22, ceasefire, stop attacking civilians, and then we can talk. Other than that, we've got nothing to say to each other, and we'll just keep going.
Okay.
I can't see any other way. Showing Putin's weakness is just going to be a disaster. And he will roll into Europe. He will, we're not talking about him turning up in Rome, Jack, but we are talking about him turning up in Estonia. We are talking about him turning up in Lithuania and Latvia, and threatening the Poles again. These are real threats.
Oh, I agree with that. But I think we have to start to articulate what actually stopping Putin really does mean, not just use it as a bland phrase.
The West needs to tell him, we can outstay you.
Mm.
We can outstay you. And we'll see how you're going in 5 years' time. We'll see how you're going then. There's no other response. I know it was very good that you did put some of this sort of, I guess that was Twitter feed stuff, but some people have actually
various sources, yeah.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
But so personally, I think that there are other responses that people will come up with, even from within Europe. There will be lots of people within Europe who will be seeking to accommodate.
This is a major problem for the global economy. I mean, this is part and parcel. While you've got conflict in the Middle East, conflict in Ukraine, this contributes to the global trade having blockages, having problems, having delays in supplies and these sorts of things. And yes, there will be an impact on global growth. Yes, there will be an impact on European GDP. But the longer it goes, you know that it's going to have a greater impact on Russia.
Yeah, but don't forget, we're only 5 years from the sainted Angela Merkel and her diplomats sneering at people for saying they had a problem with Russia. There is plenty of people in Europe who don't agree with you.
Oh, look, you can look at the genesis of any war and say, look, this should have happened then. I mean, you could say that the illegal annexation of Crimea should have drawn a significant military response from the West, but it didn't. But it's at some point you're going to have to draw a line in the sand, and that line in the sand shouldn't be the Baltic. Line in the sand shouldn't be Poland, because once that happens, we are going into a massive conflagration.
Yeah, I'm not arguing that point at all. What I'm saying to you is that within Europe, there are a lot of people who would still agree with Angela Merkel rather than the current position.
Yeah, okay. Well, there are probably a few in the UK, Corbynites and what have you. I mean, the anti-war brigade, who are anti-NATO, as it turns out. They're not anti-war. They love a bit of Russian war, but when NATO fights back, then it's the worst thing in the world.
An old Labor bloke told me that about 30 years ago during the first Gulf War. Jack, they are not peace activists. They are just on the other side.
That's exactly right. What a good comment. I like that. All right, now we've got
It's such a good comment. It stuck with me for 30-something years.
Yeah, it needs repeating. It's a beauty. All right, we're moving on to sport now. Let's start with the AFL, Jack. Really big round.
Why are we starting with the AFL for a Carlton fan?
Well, it starts with an A, Jack. It starts with an A. Now, really big round with a lot of very significant wins. Western Bulldogs really turned up. Now, the issue with them, they beat St Kilda by 10 goals at Marvel. The issue for them is their inconsistency, but their best is clearly good enough. As for St Kilda, I think they've been exposed and they may have some good games, but unless they can get rolling, they've got a problem. So a bit of a boost for the Bulldogs. Their coach has been under assault and attack. There's talk that he should be removed, that there's a disquiet among the board about him, but that was a really good win and it showcased their considerable talent.
They've got plenty of talent, just haven't been producing it.
Yeah, it was just inconsistency. The Bombers had a ripper. You might say they were a bit lucky with, was it Draper having a bit of a flop at the end there. You've got to say, though, guys, if you're from Adelaide and you're back to Crows, there were so many moments in that game where things were within your power to win that game. And they just didn't. I thought it was a terrific win from Essendon. Any win at Adelaide is a good win for a visiting side. There was a tremendous win from Essendon, who've got a few coming back. The one that really caught my eye, Jack, was Collingwood just absolutely thumping Port Adelaide. And it was like, oh, no, here they are. Here they come. Oh, God, I thought they were going to have a hangover, and they did, but it's not a very big one.
All the hallmarks of their best performances last year were back. They defended really well, and their speed of attack, leaving a pretty good defence completely lost.
Yeah, that was an ominous sign for the rest of the competition. The Blues, of course, my beloved Blues, what they did was showed the Giants that our best is better than yours. In the space of 8 minutes of play, they kicked 6 goals, won. Went from 22 points down to 15 points up, and then kicked the goal about 10 minutes later, and pretty much the game was all over. So their best is very, very good. What I liked about that win was that Mark Pitnet came in as the sort of traditional ruck role, gave Carlton absolutely belted the Giants all day in stoppage and in clearance. So Mark Pitnet's a real asset there. And Tom de Koning, who's been rucking on his own up until last weekend, enjoyed the rest, enjoyed the going forward, kicked 3 goals. He's special, that boy. He's only, well, he's 24, I think, just turned 24. He's going to be a superstar. We love him a lot. So the Blues made a bit of a statement. Tell you what, Jack, Brisbane Lions haven't won at home. I mean, they didn't lose at home last year, and they haven't won at home this year, and their season looks like it's slipping away.
There's something missing there, isn't there? Again, they're very talented, and that much vaunted forward line. I thought last year it was the most talented forward line in the competition.
They've got plenty of weapons. There's something going on there. Well, look, it was a very wet game. The Cats had the poise. And they've got a few weapons too, just quietly.
But seriously, the Lions won in the midfield.
How they can
all the figures pointed their way. Inside, everything.
I just this. How do you go from having a fortress where you can't get beaten at home to a point where you can't win? Eagles, well, that was another move in the right direction there. We at the start of the season, perhaps even 3 or 4 rounds in, we thought the Eagles were, if you looked at your side's chance of making the 8, you'd hope like hell they were playing the Eagles twice. But they're not going to be easy beats anymore. And, of course, Harley Reid, the number 1 draft pick, is just becoming a star before our eyes.
Yeah, we were talking last week and comparing his start to Chris Judd's, and that looks every bit accurate at the moment.
They'll have some good days and bad days, but they're certainly not going to finish on the bottom of the ladder. And I thought one of the other really good wins was Sydney, your beloved Sydney Swans, who played a good side. I mean, the Suns are not easy beats. They've got plenty of weapons themselves. They've got a very, very good midfield. In fact, there was a discussion before the game between some of the talking heads on which midfield you'd prefer as it stood, and the bulk of the commentators went with the Suns. Well, Sydney just absolutely, it was a drubbing against good opposition. So that's a very good sign for Sydney.
One of the things that Sydney's doing a little bit differently to most sides is that they've got about 10 players they're pushing through the midfield regularly.
Oh, I think most of the good ones are doing that, but they've still got quite a few blokes to come back into the mid, so that's a bit ominous too. They're in very, very good form at the moment, and look, it looks like you could almost say the wooden spoon is determined now, and it will be North Melbourne. They were pretty hapless against Hawthorn. I watched a bit of that game. It wasn't the absolute pinnacle of AFL football, Australian rules football, but the Hawks did enough and won by 7 goals. And it looks like North are having another rebuilding year from the bottom.
Yeah, plenty of talent, plenty of young talent there, but they're not doing much with it.
There are some big games next week. We go into the Anzac Day round. Of course, it's the traditional clash of Essendon and Collingwood. Both sides in pretty good nick, and it's almost like form doesn't count very much on the Anzac Day game. Richmond play Melbourne on the eve. Again, both sides. I mean, Richmond are in a rebuild. Melbourne are sort of their forms all over the shop. The Giants play the Lions at home on Anzac night. You'd expect the Giants to win there. Probably the big game is Carlton v Geelong, or Geelong v Carlton at the MCG as a twilight game on Saturday. You could say that Geelong haven't played anyone yet. I think they've played the Eagles, they've played North Melbourne, they've played the Lions. They haven't really played a top 4 side, I don't think. So we'll see a bit more about them. They've certainly got some real talent across the board and an emerging midfield. Carlton's midfield against the Giants by Patrick Cripps. 39, Jack. 39 possessions, 24 contested. And Sam Walsh, 17 score involvements, which is the highest it's ever been since records were kept at Carlton. So since that particular record was kept at Carlton. So those two just really led the way. So not the big games that we're expecting. Your Sydney Swans play at the G2 on the Sunday afternoon against the Hawks. You'd be thinking of another 4 points there, you'd reckon.
I've just been organising a ticket for an American mate from here who's going down. I think we're going to get him into the Swans-Carlton game on a Friday night in a few weeks hence.
Actually, Carlton have got a pretty tough month ahead of them. So it's Geelong, then I think it's Port Adelaide. No, Geelong. Is it Geelong, Collingwood, Port Adelaide, Sydney? The next four. I may have the order slightly wrong, but those are the next four contested, and we'll know a lot more about Carlton. Look, if they won two of those, I'd be happy. And they'd come away sort of 8-4.
So what's happening in the NRL? I saw a little bit of the Sharkies, and I saw the Broncos.
Are really good. Sharkies are going beautifully, and remain on top of the ladder. The Storm gave the Roosters a belting at home, and the Dragons had a win. And the Dolphins, Jack, they just don't seem to. They absolutely smashed Parramatta on the Friday night. It was all pretty much even at half time, and I thought the Earls were going to run over the top of them, and the exact reverse occurred. Panthers continued their fairly consistent form, the Sharks blew away the Cowboys, who are having some issues travelling, but 42-6, that's a big result. When we look at the ladder, we see the Sharkies on top, Storm second, Dolphins third, Panthers fourth, and throw a blanket over the rest. I was looking at some of the IPL stuff, Jack, Jake Fraser McGurk has just become an emerging star, and will be contributing to Australia in short form cricket, and then I think Test cricket will come his way too, perhaps a little later. But yeah, he is a star, and also Travis Head. Well, he's almost the best batsman in the comp, Jack, in the IPL. But we kind of knew that, didn't we? He made a very quick 100 the other day, and he hit sixes for fun. Of course, Dhoni, MS Dhoni, still playing. I don't think he's captain anymore. He's 44, Jack.
He couldn't need the money.
I think he just doesn't like the idea of retiring. Still a good player, still pretty handy.
Perhaps he's like a lot of blokes. He just likes to get out of the house occasionally.
Yes, well, there you go. Look, they do say, the English do say that you should play cricket till you're 60. I got about halfway there. So, look, I think that rounds us up in sport. You never put your women's sport in because you're a terrible bloody sexist bastard.
I am. The best thing in sport all week was a Mark Atherton column in the Australian from the London Times.
I haven't read it yet. I didn't have a chance to read it. You referred it to me. Yeah, tell me. He's a great writer.
It's about Nathan Lyon becoming the first finger spinner. I think that's a fair distinction Athers makes. He's the first finger spinner to get to 500 wickets. Murali got more, but he was really a wrist spinner. I think that's accurate. And talking about it and asking whether. I always love these little snippets. I didn't realise this, but Joe Root and Nathan Lyon played cricket together at Prospect in Adelaide. Back in the mid 2000s.
He's playing at Lancashire at the moment.
Yeah,
and taking wickets. Yeah,
yeah. But Atherton was asking whether perhaps the DRS review system has assisted Lyon, and he had an interesting stat that Tim May used to get about 8% of his wickets LBW, and Lyon goes up to 15%. And whether it's the use of the DRS means you, as an off spinner, you're much more likely to pick up that LB. You know, when the might have been a little bit of bat pad, you rule out the bat first. And,
it's changed cricket. DRS has actually changed cricket. It now means that if you're a left-handed bat, you are by 2 or 3 percentage points more likely to stay in. And that's because often bowlers bowling right arm over the wicket, whether they're slow or fast, would pitch the ball outside leg to a left-handed batsman and then go on to hit him an umps that shoots you out. But if you DRS that, you know, it becomes very clear it's not out. And so that actually means this is sort of why we see the great rise of left-handers in international cricket now. It works particularly well in England, in Australia, in South Africa, in New Zealand. Where it does fall away, that preponderance of left armers, is in India against their great off-spin bowlers who'll take the ball away from the left-handers and have them nicking out. One
thing that struck me about this, though, was how much would Warney have gotten even more wickets if he had DRS to get those LBWs, or would he not?
Gee, he got a few he shouldn't have.
Yeah,
did get a few he shouldn't have.
Well, that's what I thought too. I can remember an interview with Kevin Peterson, and they were he and Warne were teammates at Hampshire when Peterson was a young fellow. He played under Warne's captaincy, and Peterson said he would stand there. He says you'd hit it out of the middle. He'd be standing at the other end. You'd look up, and there he is. He'd be stroking his chin and exhaling, and you'd think, "Hang on, I middled that. What's the problem?" He says, but then you'd start to think, "Oh, you know."
Well, that's more a spotlight on Kevin Peterson's brain than anything else.
Yeah, no, he says,
it's just competitive stuff. It's just like, geez, you were lucky to hit that in the middle. You know, that sort of stuff.
Yeah. And I just wonder whether Warney Peterson was never any lack of self, never any self-doubt there. Yeah. But even he said, I used to start to wonder whether there was something I was missing. And I just wonder whether Warney had the same effect on the umpires. And at times he did, because he did get a couple of LBs that were terrible.
But batsmen have fairly fragile sort of character in many ways, you know, and they can basically take a bowler down, hit him for 4, hit him for 6, and they'll still think. And Marnus Labuschagne's a perfect example. I've got to change things. I've got to just keep adapting. I've got to keep, you know, and I think it gets a lot of them into some trouble. I think Marnus has had some issues because I think he changes technique too often. But this is Peterson's view too, and I heard him speak about it during the England-India series, where he was talking about you constantly had to reflect on your technique, what changes you were making. He found that he was getting his front foot almost sort of, you know, the plot on the front foot, and he needed to be making other movements to stop that because he's getting out LBW. Now, that's good thinking batsman, but as a batsman. But then there's this other side of it that you've got to, even when you're going really well, you've got to keep changing things. And I think that can get a lot of guys into trouble. Marnus apparently changes his technique pretty much every net session. So sometimes you've got to pick and stick, but be a bit flexible too. I did notice, I did read this, my mate Steve Waterson at the Oz, bemoaning the lack of handwriting. Now, I do a little bit of scribbling these days, Jack, but when you look at it, it's just awful. You know, because I do so little of it, you know.
Yeah, it's like basic mathematics. We just grab the phone and use the calculator function. I really like this from Steve Watson. He's one of my favourite writers there now, and he's talking about the handwriting and now how people use keyboards. And he said in so many areas of life, quicker is not necessarily better. Indeed, I have a couple of colleagues who can type much faster than they can think. Cowardice and good manners stop me from telling you what pages they're on, but you'll spot them if you look closely enough. I thought that was brilliant.
Gee, I hope he's not getting personal there, Steve. Look, a wonderful journalist in his own right. Speaks three languages. So I'd say when you get him on the booze all at the same time. But
it might need to be his shout when he walks into the pub next week after writing that.
I went to a book launch with one of our colleagues, and again, I won't keep it. And Steve, I'd only met him the once. This is years and years ago. I'd only met him the once, and he came up and he said, "G'day, Jack, how you going?" And I said, "I'm sorry, who are you?" So that was a bit of a horrible moment, and I haven't forgotten him since. But anyway, what else have you got to take us out, Jack?
Well, that'll do. Except that one thing that struck me this week. Why does the head of MI6, which is the...
Well, MI6 doesn't exist, Jack.
Yeah, well, officially, yes, it doesn't exist. But not only does we know it exists these days, but the head of MI6 has a Twitter feed.
Does he? This would have come as something of a shock to the Spycatcher trial, Jack, where the Cabinet Secretary tried to argue that MI6 doesn't exist. Now, the boss has got a Twitter profile.
With pronouns.
Is he, she, he, them?
It's a he, him, but yeah.
There you go. All right. Well, that takes us out for another week. And
just before we go, you know, they've had all the demonstrations at the universities in the United States, particularly the Ivy League ones at Columbia and Yale.
Columbia, I saw, yeah.
And as the people have been arrested, everyone's doing a deep dive into them, and of course they are inevitably the sons and daughters of well-to-do people and all that sort of stuff.
And there you go.
And the social media's been having a bit of fun with this. They're now referring to them as the Urban Outfitters Intifada. Or alternatively as Abercrombie and Intifada.
Oh, Abercrombie and Fitch, that's all over, Jack. That's all over. They broke the unwritten law and went very white, and basically it's all over now. I think that company's all but dead. All right, well, that takes us out for one more week. Episode 70 is done and dusted. And we just want to remind our listeners to drop us a line if you want to make comments, criticisms, whatever. We'd love to hear from you. You can get hold of me on Twitter on @JackTheInsider. DMs are open. And you can get hold of Hong Kong Jack on his Substack.
Yeah, hongkongjack.substack.com.
There you go. Or indeed, you can hit us up on email, theconditionalreleaseprogram@gmail.com. It's got a "the" in front of it, folks. All right, well, that takes us out, and we want to say enjoy your Anzac Day. This program will probably be out just around that time. Enjoy your Anzac Day. It's a big, big moment in my little country town, Jack. Streets blocked off, dawn service, all that sort of stuff. I like to get along to it because a lot of these country towns paid such a heavy price, particularly around World War One. And when you look at the cenotaph in my part of the world, you go through them and there's two, three brothers, all perished in World War One. So we want to commemorate and celebrate those people's sacrifices for our country. So enjoy your Anzac Day, folks, and we'll catch up with you next week.